I'm going to give people a minute or so to come in before we begin. Still letting people come in. You all can see my screen. So welcome everybody to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation put on by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench is a webinar series that presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries and trends, providing an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. On the Park Bench generally takes place at 12 noon on Tuesdays, not every Tuesday, but a couple of times a month. And the webinar series is intended to be a platform for CNU members to engage, debate, and collaborate on the pressing issues we're all facing and cities and towns are facing now. And let us know if you'd like to hear about something or from somebody, and we'll try to line it up. Today we have an authors forum, which is a webinar series within the series, and it discusses books that have really recently been published that are of interest to urbanists or by urbanists. And the authors forum is produced by Dura Tadani, an architect and urbanist who works behind the scenes to put these together. Today we're going to talk about Main Street, how a city's heart connects us all, with author Mindy Thompson Fullilove, and the discussion with interviewer Kennedy Smith. So share your thoughts on hashtag on the park bench, www.tinyurl.com/OTPB-feedback. And register for our next webinar, which is also at 12 noon next Tuesday, March 23rd. Columbus Downtown Development Corporation, Parks Proving Their Worth. Join us as a panel discusses the role parks will play in the future of wellness, development, and community in our cities. Go to cnu.org/resources/ontheparkbench to register and find out more. And I wanted to remind everybody that we have an upcoming Congress, CNU 29, Design for Change, our 29th annual Congress for the New Urbanism. That's going to take place May 19th through 21st, and it's going to focus on the intersection of design and power, the power design holds to influence the way we live, to physically change and adapt the spaces we inhabit, as well as how we can use it to achieve the change we want to see in neighborhoods, towns, cities, and across regions. CNU 29 is going to be another virtual Congress. You're going to be able to see it out of the comfort of your home without having to rent a motel room or book a flight. And the program is going to be every bit as good or better than any of the previous Congresses. And that is really saying something. It's going to feature multiple formats that maximize the benefits of being held virtually and encourage creativity and innovation from participants. Learn more at cnu.org/CNU29. We have a great program today with Mindy Fullilove, author, MD, LFAPA, Honorable AIA, who is a social psychiatrist and professor of urban policy and health at the New School in New York City. She's published more than 100 scientific papers and 8 books. Incredibly prolific author. Among the books, Root Shock, How Tearing Up City Neighborhoods Hurts America and What We Can Do About It, and Urban Alchemy, Restoring Joy in America's Sorted Out Cities. She's co-author of From Enforcers to Guardians, a public health primer on ending police violence. Kennedy Smith, very familiar to the CNU audience, is one of the nation's foremost experts on downtown economic development. She served as director of the National Main Street Center for 14 years, and she launched in 2004 the Community Land Use and Economics Group, a specialized downtown development consulting firm that she's still leader of, and she's now senior researcher with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I'm Rob Studeville, Senior Communications Advisor with the Congress for the New Urbanism and editor of CNU's online journal, Public Square. And today we're going to be talking about Main Street, how a city's heart connects us all, that traverses the central thoroughfares of our cities to uncover the ways they bring together our communities. And this was a result of an 11-year study of Main Streets in 178 cities in 14 countries. Incredible research project with whereby Fullilove discovered the power of city centers to help us name and solve our problems. The book was published by New Village Press in September 2020. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the format today. There's going to be a brief presentation by Mindy and Kennedy, and then a discussion between those two, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience. So use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask questions as they occur to you. We'll get to those questions as soon as that discussion is over, and the first people to ask questions will no doubt be the first ones to have their questions answered. So ask them as they occur to you. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass this along to Kennedy.
Great, thank you, Rob. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here today. And I can't tell you how happy I am to be talking with Mindy today. I read her book and I began reading it and thinking, you know, anything that's called Main Street, I'm gonna love it. But I kept reading it faster and faster and then slower and slower. I just loved it. And there are many things I loved about it. It stimulated so many ideas all at the same time. And I think that's what I maybe like best in the end, is that it synthesizes so many different pieces of what really make a main street and a city and a place in the general sense really wonderful or really bad, or something in between on the sort of healing and dying scale. And it reminded me of lots of books that I've read, and I'm sure many of the people listening in today have read, like The Image of the City by Kevin Lynch, which is you know, sort of a nice little descriptor of the different physical components of a city, lines of advantage. And we'll talk about Mindy's typology for cities in a second, but I like her spin on it. What Do People Do Downtown, written by Project for Public Spaces back in the 1980s, which was literally just sort of an inventory of, okay, 427 people have walked by here, and here's what they did after that. Mindy brings some soul to that experience. Consequential Strangers, a great book about the sort of low-key casual interactions that we have with people, the person who serves us coffee at the coffee shop in the morning and the guy who parks the car, who end up becoming really important in our lives, even though we don't know them that well, we know them through familiarity. Changes in the Land. If you guys haven't read this book, pick it up, it's fabulous. There's a wonderful part in Mindy's book where she talks about how earthworms are not indigenous to North America. Who knew? I had no idea. And completely change the ecology. And you can sort of follow that up the food chain into, earthworms emit greenhouse gases, and now we're not getting the snowpack we used to get in Vermont, and so ticks aren't freezing in the winter, and so we have more Lyme disease. And anyway, this book also kind of delves into a bit of that. And finally, Mindy had a line in the book that just slayed me, which is about a game called Alternate Orange, in which people imagine what Orange, New Jersey would have been like if the highway had not been built. It took me back to Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities and the wonderful chapter that he talks about the city named Fedora that has a museum in the middle of the town square, where everyone in the town has created a glass globe with their vision of what the city might be in the future. And of course, as soon as they put it in the museum, that future is already passed and can't be achieved. I just loved this book. It brings so many pieces together. It's, most of the people who are listening in today are probably architects or landscape architects, planners, maybe some urban designers, people who photograph cities, people who deal with policy with cities. I've always dealt sort of with the economics of this. And so I've always looked at the design components of cities in terms of how do they make the economics work well. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. I want to just, I think, turn things over to Mindy at this point to talk about her book a little bit, and then we'll come back and chat a little bit later. After Mindy talks for a few minutes, I've pulled together 15 or so slides of interesting things I've seen in my travels through main streets across the country and around the world. Some of them are good, some of them are scary, some of them are interesting, just to get her reactions, because her reactions to seeing the places that she's traveled are so multi-layered and so rich and so expansive that I'd like to hear her thoughts. And I'd encourage any of you, if you have photos of interesting places that you've seen, that you're kind of wondering what the heck is going on and what might a social psychiatrist think of this, get them out and post them in the chat, and we'll talk about those at the end too. So Mindy, with that, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you. You really made my day, Kennedy. Thank you so much. Who could have anticipated such enthusiasm? So bowled over. I thought I would start two things. That in this moment, we are facing what the Poor People's Campaign calls 5 injustices: racism, poverty, the war economy, ecological devastation, and distorted morality. And then President Biden in his inaugural address talked about 6 crises: the COVID pandemic, climate change, growing inequality, racism, America's global standing, and the attack on truth and democracy. Obviously a lot of overlap. However you want to make the list, this is a time of a lot of trouble. And part of the challenge of this study was how to fit main streets, which are these very particular and kind of little places, into this big picture. So I want to talk a little bit today about method, because I am a researcher and this is all about method. A lot of people said to me things about, because I went to 178 cities, the sort of, how did I measure things? Did I stand on the street and count how many people went by, or count anything? And the only thing I counted was how many cities I went to. My method had to do with finding a friend, if possible, and going to lunch. That was my method. And just hanging out, trying to buy something, lunch, a book, a muffin, trying to participate in the main street, at least as a consumer, and taking photos. So the way this is organized, the way I think about it, is from the framework offered by Roger Barker, who invented ecological psychology. And he said that there's such a thing as that our behavior is appropriate to the behavior setting. And he did a study of how children behaved in different behavior settings. You can see here the setting of the 2nd grade academic class, the playground, and the music class. And it changes. The children in class are little change in position, slow tempo, serious mood. On the playground, it's unorganized and they're running around and they're playing games. The music class is sort of in the middle. So the behavior patterns that we exhibit fit the setting. And one of the settings he talked about is roads and streets. So I had used this way of saying, so main streets, when we talk about main streets as a civic, commercial, social amalgam, a center, are a behavioral setting. It's open 24/7. Everybody knows where it is. It has what it has. And when we go to Main Street, we behave the way we're supposed to behave on Main Street, which is a pretty wide array of public behaviors. And that fundamentally is what makes Main Street great and special. So how did I get to see these behaviors and study this? Is by going to see the way Barker's team went to see what were the children doing. So this study, in which I went and had lunch or went to the toy store, had to do with going to see what people were doing in this milieu. And you may know that milieus are very important in psychiatry, that for people who are seriously mentally ill, we put them in hospitals or in clinics or day treatment centers. And the milieu, the place in which we're doing the treatment, is a very important part of the treatment. And I was trained at New York Hospital Westchester Division, which at that time was headed by a group of very prominent psychoanalysts. And it was a hospital where people had long stays. And so there was a lot of focus on how is it that the milieu, all the ways in which we work together, are restorative for people. So I'm very grounded in milieu. And so this was a wonderful time to use that awareness and that training that I'd had. These are some of the behavior settings that Barker encountered in the town where he did his groundbreaking work. So, but the second influence, so I'm going to go visit these things. How am I going to do that? The second influence on me, besides Roger Barker, was Hirofumi Minami, who in the photo at the top right over here, that's Hirofumi Minami, who's a Japanese environmental psychologist, was fascinated by psychoanalysis. And he had the idea that we could do a psychoanalysis of the city, that one could. And that in that way, you would get to look at the hidden stories of the city. And he was very interested in the hidden stories of Hiroshima, his hometown, because in the aftermath of World War II and the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, the narrative became very much about peace, but with a suppression of Japanese militarism and imperialism that had preceded the war. So how does that history get left out? And the psychoanalysis is to excavate the history. So he said, what we have to do is to stroll. We go see the place, and then we scroll. And by scroll, scroll in the Japanese tradition is literally a manuscript that's written on a very long piece of paper and read from right to left as it's unrolled. So it rolls from one roller onto the other. So this what you see is a Broadway stroll. This is David Chapin, the other colleague who helped us with this. And so we set up a series of walks along Broadway, 5 walks on 5 different days, pretty cold. And then after we did the walks, we met at David Chapin's office at CUNY Graduate Center to do the scroll. And the scroll was really bringing things forward that helped us make associations to what we had seen. And these are some of the associations to Broadway. You may know the book Here is New York, a children's book, which talks about Wall Street and how Wall Street was built against the native people to keep them out. This was some drawings that David made on a chalkboard in his office. This was, there was a whole thing in Times Square around people who dress up as cartoon characters and were bothering the tourists. So the people who were in charge of the public space decided that they would paint blocks on the ground, and then the cartoon characters could stay only in those blocks. Of course, as I saw it, the go-to solution in America is always segregation, sadly. And then down here, you see the brave girl who was a statue erected in the face of the Wall Street bull. At this particular moment, all the tourists were looking at the bull and not the brave girl. And all of these, and then also Michael Kimmelman had done an article in the New York Times, just as we were walking, about this building, which is an athletic center for Columbia University, but which does nothing to support the street at that point. So these are the kinds of things that we were assembling to help us understand what we had seen on Broadway, our walk, our meals, our time together, our chats, the weather, all those things that we were trying to piece together. All of this was added. So these are 4 of the many scrolls that I made. These are 4 of those that are in the book. 1 in Cleveland, 1 in Kyoto, 1 in Chartres, and 1 in Vermont, various places in Vermont. And the idea was that there was a photo, a map, where the photo was, and some text. And where these were one journey, they're all connected. You could see how I traveled. The idea of this is that I'm saying what I saw, but you could go take the same walk and see what you saw. Or you could take a different walk, which might be even more fun. And what's nice is that then people say to me, big fun, oh, I love to go to that toy store. And they point out, by the way, now it's closed. So one of the things that happens is if you were to take the same walk I took, you wouldn't see the same things I saw in some instances because they're gone or whatever. Things happen. So, so this is my method. And one of the things that's happened is that my colleagues at the University of Orange, which is a free people's school in Orange, New Jersey, became very interested in this. At U of O, we practice restoration urbanism, and we like to walk cities. And so they thought they would teach people how to do this stroll and scroll. And you can find the instructions on the University of Orange website. So this is the sort of basic model that Kennedy said I had developed, that what we call Main Street, this civic, commercial, social amalgam, is the box. It's set in a circle of urban tissue, and it's transected by a line. So that's the basic way in which I came to see Main Streets and to think about them. But what's also important is at the next level of scale over a region, in this case, Essex County, you can see that there are a lot of streets, what I came to call the tangle. And the main streets in the tangle are in different kinds of shapes. Some of them have fallen apart, been disinvested. Some places in the suburbs never built a main street, so there's no main street at all, or a little vestigial main street. Some main streets are fabulous. And we were so interested to find this series of main streets through the middle of the county. One outlier, Great Main Street, no great main streets really in the suburbs, in the deep suburbs. And then a lot in the sort of area of Newark where there'd been tremendous disinvestment, had been great main streets and had fallen apart. But this set of main streets were old enough to have been built as great main streets and had enough investment to still be prospering. So the tangle, I think, is actually where the action is when you think about society and how all of this works together for our mental health. And one of the things about behavior in a segregated society is that people go where they're supposed to go. And they don't go where they're not supposed to go. And if they go where they're not supposed to go, they get chased out one way or another. So highly problematic that in our society, the tangle isn't the fluid set of exchange points that would be the most supportive of a functioning democracy. So U of O said, so go see this, go see the box circle line or go see the tangle. And then they gave people in the trainings this template, which works really well. And then people filled it out. So Molly Rose Kaufman, who's one of the directors of the University of Orange, went to see Newark Avenue, which is near where she lives in Jersey City, shows some photos and listed all the things that she saw, a lot of things. When we were doing this class at the University of Orange, it was a big snowstorm. So I just limited my walk from my back porch to my bird feeder. I thought that was the main street of the birds, the main street I needed to see. Some other colleagues talked about downtown Fort Myers. Doug Farrand took a transect walk. So he walked 8 miles from Maplewood to Montclair, and saw a lot of things. These photos are particularly about what he saw as he went through Orange, New Jersey. And then Holly Bars went to see Springfield Avenue in Maplewood, which is so they're trying to have these flags and identify it, Springfield Ave, Maplewood. It's a little saggy, and I think they're trying to give it spirit and connection. So I think the most important thing is that the stroll and scroll is a way to give continuity and coherence to observations of this particular behavior setting, the Main Street, so that we can see what's there, we can think about the contents, we can think about the larger circle in which it's embedded, how the line runs through, and then the tangle of which it's a part. So that's a little bit about the method and then some of the findings. And I think we always have to keep in mind that this local work, this very local work on a Main Street, is in the context of a nation in crisis. And so can we use the work on Main Street to also help us solve these larger problems is, I think, the great question in front of us. So that's what I wanted to share. Kennedy, over to you.
Thank you so much. You do a great job at describing sort of the physical form of what the setup is that can make things work, that show people what kind of setting they're in and what behaviors one might expect there. But there's so much more in your book that you pack in here that is that is the connective tissue that truly holds it together. And there's just so many things that I just loved. One of them is you talked about on one of these lines, you and your daughter hopscotching from one bit of intact fabric to another. And it's so sad. And you also talk in another part about how do you fix a broken box. And you had a great photo in your book of a broken box. I've tried to find one in my own collection. Let me pop this up here and show, which isn't exactly as broken as the one that you showed. But I wondered what your thoughts were on how you do fix a broken box and how you can reconnect, not just in terms of physical, infrastructure and building, but how can you re-knit pieces of a city that have come apart?
Yeah, I mean, it's really the fundamental question. And I got to really think through a lot of the reknitting process in my previous book, Urban Alchemy, which is Restoring Joy in America's Sorted Out Cities, where looking at the work of restoration urbanists around the country, identified what I called 9 elements of urban restoration. And so that's really where you want to start. But if we just take this picture, thank you for this. I don't know if people can see my cursor. I can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor move, Kennedy?
No.
Okay. Well, but let's say the first thing obviously is the street. And so it looks wide and barren and there are no trees. I mean, the first thing you want to do, just because you just want to do it, is plant some trees. Just widen these sidewalks. The street is wide, the sidewalks are too narrow. Widen the sidewalks and put in a layer of trees, which would harmonize and humanize this whole landscape and give it coherence. And that's what we're looking for. We want to make it more friendly, more personable, and that's one of the things trees do in a landscape. Then the issue is that this is not very friendly, and this is not very friendly. There's nothing friendly about it, but there are a lot of things that people do to make something more friendly, and they're not necessarily very expensive. So that's really becomes the first step, is to do the simple, friendly things that make you feel like, oh, okay, I could walk down that street. I think that's where you start. It doesn't have to cost a lot. It's just the wanting to be friendly, which is what Jake Eisenberg and I talk about as Main Street, is the Main Street hospitable? Does it invite people to come and socialize?
Yeah, I like to think that we're making some progress in a lot of communities. People like Mike Lydon who are talking about tactical urbanism, low cost, perhaps temporary interventions that can begin to make a place look more lively and feel more inviting, so that then there becomes more of an oomph there, more critical mass of activity that might lead to economic revitalization. Another issue that I grapple with some, and you touched on in a light way in a couple of places in your books, and I'd like your thoughts on it. This is something that that comes into my work quite often, is a main street if it has mostly national chains? What's the importance of locally owned businesses to helping shape a community's personality? So here are a few places, old places and new places that have a high propensity of chains. What do you think?
I think that that's an important and useful question. There's no argument. I don't think there's any argument that having local stores is more fun and more interesting. But a main street isn't just commerce. And I think that's really one of the things, this word amalgam just came to me a lot as I was visiting, that commerce is one part of the amalgam. I mean, I'm somebody who had a bad dentist as a child, so I have a lot of amalgam in my mouth. So maybe why it's so vital to me. And many people my age had a bad dentist. So like there was bad dentistry at that time. So amalgam is very important to my being able to eat. Anyway, this is an amalgam. So there's the public space, there's commerce, and then there's civic stuff that's going on, whatever it is. For example, street signs, that's part of the civic. The electric boxes, it's part of the civic. There may be a library or a police station or a city hall. So we can get carried away if we think we have to control the commerce, or what we have to control is making the public and the civic civil. And the commerce is going to come and go. What's going to happen to all these big box stores? I was invited to write a paper for a special issue on storefronts because these scholars think that all the storefronts all these commerce is going to close. Maybe not the CVS, but a lot of it is going to, all these big box stores. Williams-Sonoma going to have big box stores after the pandemic. Probably not as many, if they have any. So I think commerce comes and goes. It's always important, and you want to support it, but you can't it's not the only thing on Main Street. So you want to decenter it a bit. That's my real thought about that. Does that make sense to you, Kennedy?
Yeah, it does. It's I mean, it's certainly changing right now, the nature of what commerce is in the US and the world. One of the things that I've been spending a lot of time on lately is, it's going to sound odd, but is third-party restaurant meal delivery apps, which are typically charge 30% or more to the restaurant of the cost of a meal, which is, during this pandemic, is gutting restaurants. It used to not be so significant before the pandemic because it was sort of a loss leader to bring in new customers for restaurants, and they could absorb it. But now it's absolutely killing them. And there are a number of places, 50 or 60 communities and states around the US have enacted temporary fee caps to charge that. But the point is that at the same time that this is all happening and restaurants are in such distress, I've found probably 80 or 100 local delivery services that have popped up around the country. And they've done it because they know they can operate charging restaurants between 0 and 5% and passing on more cost to the customer, or making it function as a co-op. So that there isn't that. Yeah. And the point of it is that it's sort of a profit motivation that is driving these third-party apps to charge these astronomical fees. And we're essentially shifting wealth from Main Street to Wall Street. It's the venture capitalists and the equity investors that we're feeding by doing that. So it's a broken system that's sort of accelerating, and that's playing through in many different parts of commerce right now. And one of the things that I loved about your book was that you talk in many different ways and in many different chapters about wealth. And how one builds wealth in a community, and what's happening to the country, that wealth is sort of dissipating from here and going someplace else. You talk about it. A great line said, at some point, the inconsiderate rush for money, the needs of people will be lost. Needs like blue sky that can be seen from the coffee shop window. That's so true. And then when you talked about why did Trump win? I loved your response. The answer was that President Obama and the Democrats had not turned around the growing inequality in wealth, the terrible job situation facing former industrial workers, and a constant sorting of communities by race and class. That transfer of wealth is really disturbing to me, and I wondered if you had a little bit more you could say about that.
I have so much I could say about that. One of my assignments at the New School is to teach political economy of the city. So I get to blab about that at great length. But in the New York Times today, there was an article saying the Democrats have become self-critical around those programs, hence the large relief act that they've passed, which may lead to more substantial programs that help poor and working people. So I think that's a a great shift. I mean, we had 40 years of growing inequality where wages of working people have been flat and wealth has become concentrated in the hands of a very small number of people around the globe. And that's an intolerable situation. But the second part, so there's a second part, there's two other layers to that that make it very problematic. One is that people get wealthy by taking, and to some extent, by taking from things we hold in common. So your point about the delivery services taking the profits of the restaurants, I think, is part of that. And so government should be protecting in a famine or situation, which is a parallel to a pandemic. Government caps food prices so that people can't, really exploit the starving. And in this situation, government could cap food delivery prices because people are being exploitative of the desperate needs of all of us who are sheltering in place. But we failed to do that, and we act only on behalf of the corporations, helping to concentrate the wealth. So the wealth is all flowing into the hands of these few people. So the tech giants, Jeff Bezos, his fortune went up by $1 billion, whereas a lot of people are maybe permanently unemployed because of this situation. And that's fuels this pandemic and the next one. So this is very bad for the survival of our species. But the next thing is that these processes, they maintain power by dividing people. And we are so divided and so fractured at this point. And that democracy can't work if you're divided, because then you just want to fight with each other and argue with each other, whereas democracy requires conversation. So those are things that trouble me a lot. And as a physician, I see them as inimical with population health.
It'll be interesting to see what changes in cities linger after the pandemic, what kinds of things we decide to hang on to, what kinds of things we have realized we've done wrong and might decide to do differently. I don't know what that's going to be yet. Do you have any sense of what might stick and what might go?
I think that one of the things is that they'll be dancing in the streets. Do you ever listen to the song by Martha and the Vandellas? They'll be dancing in the streets.
Calling all around the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Every guy grab a girl. I think this summer there's going to be, and there should be, dancing in the streets. But I don't know what's going to happen after that. But I think just everybody needs to dance. It's been very, very hard.
Well, I think what's clear is it's going to be on Main Street and not at the shopping mall. So
you can't dance it. You can't have a big dancing party at the shopping mall. This
right.
is public space. You could go dance there. You could dance right in front of the CVS pharmacy. You could see the jitterbuggers jumping over that little fence, that little railing.
Right. I loved one of your lines was, open to the weather, Main Street is also open to panhandlers, parades, murder, and blooming trees. And it's so far, it's the one place where all your civic rights are in place. So I'm going to just show you some pictures. And I used to do this thing in presentations when I talk to people in person, where I would have just a crazy mix of slides, and I would have people yell out the top of their lungs as fast as they could, is this cool or not cool? And the point being that no one knew what it was, but sort of like the definition of pornography, I know it when I see it. So I'm not going to go that fast, but just as I go through, just tell me if there's anything about the picture that evokes an idea for you or a thought about the physical space and how people, that was my cue for wealth, for what the space means and how people might act there.
Yeah, this is that same problem of the wide street and the skinny sidewalk. Where are the people supposed to go? Can we make some room for them? So I mean, I grew up in the 50s, so 50s and 60s store signs feel like home to me. But because they're also, obviously a lot of disinvestment, just a lot of rust coming down from that eagle, and the eagle photo has moved. What's going on here? And one thing is that cities, this was taught to me by my urbanism teacher, Michel Cantel-Dupart, who's a renowned French architect and urbanist. He said, cities want to put in these bricks and things to make things cute, so-called cute. But that's not really the issue. The issue is more structural, it's deeper. Have you connected things? Have you widened sidewalks? Have you put in trees? Have you done the kinds of things that make flow? And these bricks don't do anything for flow. And that, one of the measure, did your urbanism help, is that business should be booming, and it's not. So not
Excellent
good.
point. No.
And here we got booming. So this is good. So cute. How beautiful, right? Since 1910. That's beautiful.
One of the things I think you address so eloquently in your book is the issue of time. In fact, you make it another dimension of the physical manifestation of the street. And that's something, obviously my work has been I'm centered around historic downtowns forever. And so I can't imagine a downtown that doesn't have history, something historic in it as a touchstone and a reference point. And I can't help but walk by a building like this and not blur my eyes and try to envision what it looked like in 1910 and how happy the people were when they first opened the store and all of that.
How happy they are to see it now.
Yeah. So I actually mentioned this to you the other day. I was
wondering,
I was in Bucharest a few years ago, and every inch of every surface was covered with graffiti, just everywhere. And at first I was a little taken aback by it, but our Romanian friends who were with us were saying, isn't it glorious? People have taken back the city after the long regime of Ceausescu and the communists, and they're making it their own now and writing their names and writing their messages everywhere.
So I worked in Harlem and the South Bronx in the 90s when there was lots of graffiti. And, graffiti is, it's a very special moment. And it's both about power and powerlessness, very complicated. Some of the graffiti that was most touching to us is, as public health people, was the graffiti for people who had been murdered. There were a lot of murder going on, a lot of violence at that time. And so various murals had been erected to loved ones. So it's this sort of power and powerlessness, right? Coming out of a dictatorship, and then how do you start to express yourself? It's sort of how do you voice what's going on in your world? So it becomes very important to say to people, what's the graffiti about? As you did. It's that listening to graffiti, if I may invent a book title.
I've seen the face of Rob Studeville appear, which means that we need to move on to Q&A from our attendants. But I'm going to fast forward through some of these. I just love that when I said to put that in.
It's great. It's really great.
But I wanted you to tell this story because I just love this. From
about the
the strolling of the heifers.
Strolling of the heifers.
Yeah.
So every year on the first Saturday in June, my group, which is City Life is Moving Bodies, has a party in northern Manhattan parks called Hike the Heights, where we hike to a party place. It's to advocate for investment in these upper Manhattan parks, which have gotten a lot of investment. We are very grateful to say. But the same day in Brattleboro, Vermont, there's the strolling of the heifers. My best friend from medical school, Martha Stittleman, lives right near Brattleboro, and it has been my guide to the small towns and cities of Vermont. And so she had always said, come up for it. But I had to get permission to miss class from Hike the Heights to go to the strolling of the heifers. And so, you can see the crowds there sitting on the sidewalk. So it's just, you just sit there, and then people walk by with their heifers. And then there's old fashioned farm equipment. And the year that I went, Bernie Sanders went by. He was just becoming a presidential candidate. And it was very exciting because this was the home crowd. So it's a festival that they started to have solidarity with dairy farmers and with farming in Vermont, which is obviously very threatened. And the combination of the farm and the city here, I think, is a model. There's an essay in a book that I used to teach from, which said that how do you know you're a city? And they had 10 criteria, but one of them was where your food comes from. And I think by that measure, all of our cities are failing. We don't know where our food comes from. But this is about knowing where your food comes from. Great event. First Saturday of June.
There's one more picture I wanted to show, this one, and to ask you a very specific question. One of the, this is an example, this is Candy Chang, great public artist who, this was after Katrina, and she put these, I wish this was stickers outside a vacant storefront people could slap on what they wanted to crowdsource some ideas for new businesses. But one of the things that I have noticed in my work with communities that are doing new urban planning activities, new comprehensive plans, new specific plans, whatever it might be, is that they tend to have a big charrette and people can come and participate, wander around and talk to the designers. But it always seems to me that the people who come to events like that are people who are inclined to come to events like that, and that there are a lot of people in the community who don't, and they aren't reached in these public planning processes. One of the things I liked about this Candy Chang thing was that it's just a very sort of casual thing that anybody walking by can pick up a tag, slap it on the building, and not feel intimidated by having to come into a room with people that they don't know or feel comfortable with. And I wondered, in all your travels with these communities and talking to people who are helping shape them and make them better, if you've come across any ideas or thoughts about how to engage the entire community in a more comprehensive and holistic way than we may typically do in our daily work.
It's a great question. You know, Churchill says we shape our buildings and then they shape us. So the question of, so how are we going to shape our buildings is the question. If they're going to shape us, how are we going to, if we think about redlining and how it has shaped us, all the research that's emerging around that, these are profound choices. So the how ought to be a lot bigger. One of the people that I've worked with, Julie Erickson, who's a consultant here in the Oranges, has an incredible way of doing strategic planning where you can have hundreds of people come to a visioning, and then work together. So at the University of Orange, we did a huge visioning with all the community people to develop our strategic plan. But your point is, how do you get the people to the visioning? You could have hundreds, but can you get them in the room? And that's really about lines of connection. And in a highly fractured, highly segregated society, it's not simply that they might feel a little uncomfortable. It's that the lines of connection actually don't exist. Your point about the casual connections, the guy who sells us our coffee, the guy who's the parking valet, all the people who are these weak ties that we have in communities holding us together, these suffer very badly under the kinds of processes that we've had over the past 40 years in the United States. They just don't exist. So we're up against the way to solve our problems. We have to solve the problem to solve the problem. We have a prior step, which is we don't have the connectors. So we have to go do the basic shoe leather organizing of finding connectors to get the people in the room. Once you get the people in the room, you can make the right plan. You can answer the how. I think the important thing is to make the how very big. How are we going to shape this? And are we going to shape it for equity? Are we going to shape it for inclusion? Are we going to shape it for survival, not only of our species, but of our ecosystem? If we're not, we're going to be in really big trouble, bigger trouble than we're in now. So the how becomes an imperative.
Yeah. There are a bunch of questions that people are typing in. Let me go through some of them. Janice Bloomgart says, yes, what about the trend for gated communities and people who want to feel safe? Corporate takeover of our whole lifestyle?
Yeah, those are mostly people who didn't have to read Edgar Allan Poe in high school. They should be forced to read The Mask of the Red Death. It will get in there. The White House has super spreader events, you know?
Right.
There's no gated community.
Yeah. Stephanie Bothwell says, you mentioned making a place more friendly as a first step. Would you continue to bring us along in that line of thinking? How do we create public space management that encourages diversity and openness and not over-manage or clean up? What might the role of business improvement districts be in that equation?
Well, one of the things is policing. I work closely with psychiatrist Jake Eisenberg and on some pieces of this. And we were both very intrigued by the very aggressive policing in South Orange, New Jersey. I live in West Orange, and South Orange, New Jersey has an attractive downtown, and Black kids from Newark like to come there. There's a movie theater, there's other things kids like. It's a comfortable place. but the South Orange, which is ritzier and whiter, doesn't like them. So the police push them out. So policing is business improvement districts like policing. And so one of the things is back off on policing, let people come. And figure out how you give social cues for what the kind of behavior, the range of behaviors that you want in your milieu. You control the milieu, use the milieu as the control, not the police.
I think business improvement districts have a great role there in that they can sort of casually, help people on the streets without policing per se.
Absolutely. There are a million ways to tell people about behavior without a single sign, without a single policeman. Yeah. And that's where the fun is. Then it gets to be fun. We want people to not litter. Well, how do you do that? That's cool.
Any ideas?
Without trash cans.
Right.
You have to ask them, why'd you litter? Usually they're mad. So what are they mad about?
Bad dentistry. Whatever it might be.
God, don't get me started.
Conrad Kickert says, how do we maintain our main streets as a relevant commons and political arena in an era in an era that its commercial function is changing and declining? We've talked about the changing commerce a little bit, but not so much about how do we keep it. Like, let's assume that we're going to have higher vacancy rates, or that the type of uses that we have in downtowns and in main streets is really going to change a bit. How do we make sure that we're keeping it as a relevant commons and political arena?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because a lot of things, like, say, churches take over a storefront. A church isn't the same kind of third space that a coffee shop is, or even a department store. People don't go in and out. It's just the church people go in and out, and at fairly limited hours. So the sort of Jane Jacobs keep people moving 24/7 becomes a different kettle of fish if all of a sudden your main street is filled with churches. If the churches occupy the storefronts, which they will, because there's always a lot of churches and they're always looking for space. So, which isn't to say you should keep the churches out, but it becomes a challenge. How do you keep the flow on the main street? So I think the issue is that there are all kinds of forms that people invent. So, for example, a student of mine has been working in the Bronx and has noticed that large stores have inside of them many small stores. And so sort of the idea that you could have a large store, which is a food court and has a lot of small stores. So that people just invented that for themselves. So the idea is to look around for what are the inventions, and the kinds of organizations that you've led and worked with and the kind of ideas you share with people. Very important in this period is that everybody's got to be thinking about what are the resolutions of this empty storefront issue. So there's a lot of empty storefronts. But if you focus on the storefronts as all that's going on, you could get confused. So it's also the sidewalks, the streets, the trees. Have a tree planting event, have dancing in the street. Use the social aspect of it to make it useful for people. People go to Main Street because it's useful. What do they need? People need a lot of healing. America's very battered from this period of time. Wherever you want to start it, one report said 4 years, 40 years, and 400 years. So we want to start at 400 years ago, or 4 years ago, or 4 days ago. We're battered and we need to dance in the streets. What does that mean in your neighborhood? So make Main Street useful. It's not just commerce, and it's not just storefronts. It's other things.
Yeah, I can't wait for those parties.
Me either.
Looking forward to them.
Yeah.
Andrea Vergara says, and we've touched again on some of these things, but she says, thanks for a great presentation, Mindy. I found what you said about main streets telling a city's history very interesting. Nowadays, with COVID, several main streets have added parklets and outdoor areas for patrons that speak about our current situation. Do you have any thoughts about other changes main streets will experience with this pandemic, or changes in human behavior post-pandemic, besides dancing in the street? I added that last part.
Did you? Besides, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that is really the question. I think it's an open question, and that everybody's thinking about it. But I really want to emphasize the tangle, that main streets are in a tangle here, and that the least resourced ones will plummet the most. That's what's happening given the inequality. A stressor on an unequal system is going to hurt the least resourced pieces most. So it doesn't land equally. COVID affects everybody, but it's not the same weight on different sectors. So the least resourced main streets are going to fall apart the most. If you're working on a well-resourced main street, you have options, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to be injured in the larger sense of the we by the collapse of the poorer resourced main streets. So the real issue is there an organization that gets all the main streets in your region thinking together and working together on this problem solving? That would be the thing that would create the deepest and strongest improvement in health.
Mm-hmm.
And all the public health people say that this isn't the only bug out there, and that some of the bugs out there are much worse than this one. We have bungled our management of this pandemic very badly. But if we have a pandemic where the death rate is 10% or 25% or 50%, imagine bungling that. Well, how are we going to not bungle it? We have to be able to talk to each other, listen to each other, pay attention to science. It's a lot of changes in our social behavior that are urgently needed. And so can we take our approach to what happens to main streets post-pandemic and use it to fix society so that we're ready for the very grave difficulties that await us in the future? Climate change is not going to be friendly. You know, what if the Gulf Stream veers off? What happens then? Did you see that movie where the temperature plummeted to absolute Kelvin?
Yeah.
Terrifying. I asked my colleague Rod Wallace, who's a physicist, if that was going to happen. He said, no, not that. He said, not that. Something terrible. The Gulf Stream moving is terrible. It's terrible. So let's use our main streets to take care of the Gulf Stream.
Yeah. A few more. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Lynn Ellsworth asks, who's supposed to do the work of animating Main Street? Who represents the citizens of a place as opposed to, say, just the businesses?
I think that is the big question. That and that's the how, right? How does this all affect us? And the processes of the past 40 years have been processes of disempowering people. How do you accumulate wealth in the hands of a very small number of people? You have to disempower everybody across the board. So there are very few people left standing who have a strong voice, very few. And that was purposeful public policy. But I think it has to start with, as everybody agrees, to have a dance party, all you need is a DJ and a flyer. And I could hire a DJ and make a flyer by myself. So, and I have 10 friends who would come. Kennedy will come. So
absolutely.
I think, you know, the old saying, we're the ones we've been waiting for, is we're the ones we've been waiting for. But we have to acknowledge that we're disempowered, we're very battered, and we're in very dangerous position. And if we start from that, okay, it's a little heavy, it's a little hard, I got to push this rock up a big hill. If we start from there, we can do a lot.
It reminds me of one of the things that Buckminster Fuller said, which I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have it in front of me, but basically he said, if you see something that needs to be done and no one's doing it, it's your job.
There you go.
Yeah.
As people say, the question that we each have to ask ourselves is, what is mine to do in this moment?
Right. Ian Saltzman asked an interesting question. He says, with the dying of local journalism, what are some alternative ways that urban residents can tell the story of their city's past, present, and future?
I love that question. And at the University of Orange, we created a website called Hidden Treasures of Orange. And we did an initial kind of a posting of stories. It's a gorgeous website. But then we sort of didn't really have a way to keep adding to it. We wanted to keep adding to it, but we didn't have a way. So we decided that we would create an October term, which we're calling Octerm, which will have an octopus as its mascot. And Octerm will be when we collect and post new stories. Not everybody has a Free People's University in their city, but everybody could, because it's free. So I think, like you know, we have a lot to learn. I think it's very essential that we know our local history.
Yeah, I do too. Fiona Adams writes in, couldn't churches take on a responsibility to be more engaging with the community to help make the place more dynamic? It's interesting, the role of churches in all of this. We have some urban congregations closing, some reviving. I wonder what your observations have been in your travels about the role of churches in making this happen.
Well, as I write about in the book, my congregation, which is a Unitarian Universalist church in Orange, New Jersey, has been thinking about this a lot. How can we be helpful to the city? But I think it's really a very turning outward kind of process. It didn't happen instantly that we said, oh, let's be a better church. Let's turn outward. And so we were really helped by connecting with a church in Indianapolis that had turned outward and was using asset-based community development, and that came and met with us and taught us. So I think it's an each one teach one, and that congregations that are doing this, you know, you can call them up and say, how did you do that? I think it's fundamental. It's in the sense churches are one of the churches are not as strong as they used to be, but they're an existing organization. In some Black communities that I visited, they're like the last man standing. All the restaurants are gone, everything, banks are gone, everything is gone, but the church is still there. So how does the church turn outward and help the community? It's essential and important, and ask a church that you see doing something you admire. It's what we did, and it worked for us.
Yeah. A few comments in the chat, not in the Q&A, that I think are worth mentioning. Richard Glazer, inspired by what you've said, it says, right on, motivated agitators, activists need to go forth and initiate change. Their vision, when it emerges, can pull others along like a Pied Piper. In my city, Rochester, several of us have done an immense amount to open the public's eyes.
I love Rochester. And it's one of the great plans of my life to go there in lilac season. I keep getting invented in like March, no lilacs in March in Rochester. So yay, Rochester.
Well, yeah, Richard Glazer, I think you should invite Mindy to come there in lilac season.
Thanks, Kennedy.
Okay. Well, we are at 1 o'clock. I'm mindful of the time. Rob, I think I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, so this has been a great discussion, and we are at 1 hour point. I don't know if there are any more questions that could be answered. I haven't. Are there more there, Kennedy, that you've seen, or are we pretty much done?
I think we've covered most of the questions people have asked. It sort of came up in our discussion as it was. If we have a second, I'd like to show one more thing to Mindy and have her tell a story that I love from her book. Do we have time for that?
We do, absolutely. And I'll just say that for those that have to leave now, that there will be a video posted in a day or two. You can see the last part. But sure, go right ahead, Kennedy.
Great. Recognize this place, Mindy? Coogan's.
Asai.
I love the story in your book. I thought it said so much about what makes a community, and I wondered if you could share the story quickly with people who haven't read the book yet.
Yeah. Coogan's is an Irish pub restaurant on Broadway at between 168th and 169th Street. And it had 3 owners, and they were just people devoted to community. They really understood and believed in community. And they wanted to make their restaurant a place where all the communities of Washington Heights could come together and just enjoy themselves. And they did make that in many, many, many ways. So, you know, part of it was that you walked in the door and you were just welcomed, and they just chatted with you, and they had a lot of great things to say. They were great hosts. So the building the restaurant was in was owned by Presbyterian Hospital. Presbyterian Hospital decided they would raise the rent. And basically the community rose up in furor. And there was a petition that got 15,000 signatures in 48 hours. And people were just calling in from around the world saying, you can't close Coogan's. So the hospital was forced to back down and give them a reasonable rent. And that was a great victory for a place that really understood how to build community. Sadly, they decided to close in the face of the pandemic, but I am certainly grateful for all the wonderful moments they created in my life, and how sustaining and generous, and local businesses that help the local community in that generative kind of way that we all know is so important. Great people, great job.
I really love it when communities come together to save businesses in particular, but also to really express their what they love about a community. They're really telling a story in doing that, coming together, really telling a story that was important. things keep popping up here. One quick one. Do you have any comments on the Soho, NoHo upzoning, particularly in light of my belief that New York City's big real estate control of our planning? I think it does more harm than good, and we need a major correction.
I'm not a big fan of upzoning. This upzoning has been, and I think the communities that have fought it are fighting the good fight. And you know, the whole turning Manhattan into this place of wealth and power, and driving everybody who's poor or working class, driving all the industry out. These are bad decisions, and they start with bad decisions. The Regional Plan Association forcing all manufacturing out of New York. This is not a way to make a vibrant, successful, stable city. So I think it's bad. Fight it.
Rob, I think we're kind of there. There are a couple of questions people have asked about how to make their main streets beautiful as well as welcoming, but I have a feeling that you have some upcoming sessions that might answer some of those questions.
Well, yeah, we're always coming back to Main Street. I think Main Street is a topic that you know, is so central to urbanism in towns and cities, and of course, design is the significant factor. Next week, we're going to be talking about parks and landscaping in the downtown. So that will no doubt touch on it from that angle. I wanted to thank Mindy Thompson Fullilove and Kendi Smith for a great discussion today, and everybody who participated and asked great questions. Once again, you know, come back. We've got more on the park benches coming up that will have similar discussions. And so thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks, Rob.
I just want to say, Richard, I'm coming over to your beautiful downtown Victorian in Rochester to see the lilacs. Maybe not this year, but next year.